Okay, I'm going live right now in just a few seconds, everybody.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Going to admit all and stop share just right now.
Great.
So where everybody's in.
Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. Welcome. Okay, I think we're all here. Good evening, everyone. I'm Joel Whitney, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the July Climate Reads. This is co-presented with Orion Magazine and Writers Rebel New York City. And the July Climate Reads features Elizabeth Rush, Carolina de Robertis, and Matt Bell discussing Patricia Engel's Veins of the Ocean. You'll all have a chance to weigh in on the book. I'm always curious how many of you read it in advance, but I know that some of you may have finished half or the whole book. It's okay. We know how it goes. We just want to hear from you. And about at the 30 minutes mark or thereabouts, you can start thinking about your questions, and we'll put a little prompt in the chat, and we'll be glad to hear from you. We are also, when we're all there at the Central Branch of Brooklyn Public Library, we are in the Lenapehoking, the unceded lands of the Lenape people. When we can, we invite our friends from the Lenape Center, Joe Baker and Adrian Kumans, to welcome audiences, as we did at Night of Philosophy a few years back, and actually welcome people to the Lenapehoking homeland, which they generously frequently do. The library is committed to recognizing this, not just through verbal acknowledgements, but through our programming and the knowledge we share with Brooklyn's nearly 2.7 million inhabitants and visitors beyond the borough. Thank you to our co-presenters at Orion Magazine. Amy will speak to you about that shortly, and Writers Rebel New York City, who have kind of invented and co-presented and cross-promoted this. And their websites are orionmagazine.org and xrrebelnyc.wordpress.com. Again, we'll drop those in the chat. You can follow the library's arts and culture programming through following the handle BPL Presents. That's what we call our department. And we're back next month with the final book in this year-long conversation of nonfiction and fiction books about climate reads. The book next month is Trace by Laurette Savoy. And before I introduce our esteemed panelists, let me also just quickly turn it over to Amy Brady, from the Executive Director of Orion Magazine. Amy, would you offer a little hint about the great work that Orion is doing?
I will. Thank you so much, Joel. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. It is such a pleasure to once again co-present this amazing event with the Brooklyn Public Library and Writers Rebel New York City, both of them doing incredible work in the climate storytelling space. If you are joining any event as a part of this series, you may already be familiar with Orion. But if you're not, Orion Magazine is a print magazine that's dedicated to environmental writing and writing about the natural world. Next year, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary. And in these 40 years, we have published some of the finest writers working, including the great Elizabeth Rush, who you will be hearing from today. We are honored to call her a contributing editor for Orion. If you enjoy Patricia Engel's book or any of the works that have been discussed as a part of the Climate Read series, you will love Orion Magazine. And so as a thank you for all of you for being here today, I want to offer you a 20% discount to a print subscription. And you can access that by going to a link that I'm going to drop in the chat box right now. There you are. If you are not a subscriber, please consider subscribing. If you know somebody who cares as much about climate and other environmental concerns as you do, consider giving a gift subscription. You can also use that same link. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Joel. I look forward to the conversation. It's going to be a good one.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Amy. Orion is great, and if you're new to it, you're in for a treat. And I want to introduce our moderator today. Elizabeth Rush is the author of Rising: Dispatches from the New American Shore, which is a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in general nonfiction, and also Still Lifes from a Vanishing City: Essays and Photographs from Yangon, Myanmar. Her work explores how humans adapt to changes enacted upon them by forces seemingly beyond their control, from ecological transformation to political revolution. Her essays have appeared in the New York Times, Harper's, Granta, Creative Nonfiction, Orion, of course, Guernica, and others. Rush is the recipient of fellowships from the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Howard Foundation, Oregon State University's Spring Creek Project, the Society for Environmental Journalism, the National Society of Science Writers, and the Metcalf Institute. She teaches at Brown University and is currently at work on a book about motherhood in Antarctica's diminishing glaciers. Elizabeth will be in conversation with a writer of Uruguayan origins, Carolina de Robertis. She is the author of 5 novels, including The President and the Frog and Cantoras. She's received 2 Stonewall Book Awards, a Reading Women Award, an NEA Fellowship, Italy's Regium Julie Prize, I hope I said that right, and numerous other honors. Her books have been translated into 17 languages. De Robertis is also an award-winning translator of Latin American and Spanish literature and editor of the anthology Radical Hope, Letters of Love and Dissent in Dangerous Times. In 2017, the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts named De Robertis on its 100 list of people, organizations, and movements that are shaping the future of culture. She teaches at San Francisco State University and lives in Oakland, California with her wife and 2 children. And it's one of those many events we've done during the pandemic where many of us are in different places. And so it's been a pleasure. One of the few silver linings of this period we've been living through. Similarly, Matt Bell's latest novel, Appleseed, was published by Custom House in July 2021. So we have some fresh books and some forthcoming books. His craft book, Refused to Be Done, A Guide to Novel Writing, Rewriting, and Revision, will follow in March 2022 from Soho Press. He's also the author of the novel Scrapper and In the House Upon the Dirt, Between the Lake and the Woods, as well as the short story collection A Tree or a Person or a Wall, a nonfiction book about the classic video game Baldur's Gate 2, and several other titles. A native of Michigan, he teaches creative writing at the Arizona State University. And please welcome everyone today. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Amy. It is an absolute honor to be here with you, Carolina and Matt, tonight to talk about the veins of the ocean. As you probably got a sense from Joel's introduction to my work, I'm a creative nonfiction writer, and over the last decade, I've written almost exclusively about coastal communities and their struggle to adapt to rising seas. And I'm really interested in this idea that climate change can bring us closer together, and especially people who live sort of far from centers of power. And so when I got this invitation to lead this conversation about the veins of the ocean, I looked at the back cover and was like, great, it's about Miami, Cartagena, Havana, places that I know pretty well, in part because of the vulnerability that they share. And there was some part of me that thought, so I started reading, and I kept on waiting for the seas to start rising, and I kept on waiting for the flood to start to dismantle these places. And I wanted to see how people in this novel were going to start to work together. And so I mean to say, like, I projected a lot about what I was going to find in this book because of the lens that I come to it with. And so it was really probably not until like page 150 that I started to realize, oh, this isn't a book about the ocean as a menace. Instead, it appears as connective tissue, as a teacher, as a mother. And it presents the characters an opportunity to sort of move beyond themselves into something new. And so as a writer, that started to really engage me. I started to think, here's a rare example of what I think of as the more than human world becoming a real character in this book and being an agent of change. And so I'm really interested in how this author pulled that off, and what it also means that we're starting to see the more than human world enter into, mainstream fiction in this way that feels very transformative to me. And sort of its implications for how we think about climate change and how we as a society relate to, I shouldn't say, this collective we is probably how through literature we're learning to relate to the more than human world in ways that are surprising and radical, and contain, I think, some kernels for real possible change looking forward in the future. And so that's something that an idea that I want to return to in this conversation. And I also, I think, want to start by just asking Matt and Carolina to tell us a little bit more about sort of who you are and how you came to this work. I think the lens that we carry into our reading is so important in terms of determining, what we see, what we pick up on. So maybe we can start there. What surprised you? How did this book come into your life? And we can go, our conversation can unfold from that point. So either Carolina or Matt.
Carolina, I'll let you start. Go ahead, please.
I was saying the same thing to you. Go for it, Matt.
And I know you've had a longer relationship with the book because you reviewed it when it came out, and I think me and Elizabeth are coming to it pretty fresh. I hadn't read Engels before. I bought Infinite Country when it came out, but I haven't read it yet. So this was actually my first encounter with her work. And I think because I had been invited to this conversation and given the book in the same frame of the sort of climate reads, I had a similar first reaction to Elizabeth. I was really curious to see that when you sent us your questions of sort of like, how are we thinking of this as a climate change novel, and I think that was really fascinating too. And it's interesting that we both had that experience of it. I remember talking to my wife, and I was like 100 pages in, being like, I'm curious a little bit about the choosing of it. And then 200 pages in, I was like, oh, I get it. Like, I see now. I'm like, it's starting to unfold for me. What a beautiful book. What a beautifully written book. I mean, I was so intoxicated with the language of the book and the way it moves between English and Spanish, and the way that it just holds your attention close to the world. That by itself feels like part of it being a climate book. Like, its attention to the world, both humans and non-humans, seems so moving and impressive, and asking you to pay attention in the way that Engels does. I think the middle stretch of the book where Raina works in the dolphinarium was incredibly sort of moving and interesting to me. And I really like to read the book again, knowing it's there. I really feel the way that sort of central action sort of just moves in both directions from the book. I mean, I would read the beginning differently knowing it was coming than I did sort of this time. I'm really curious what it's like on a second read. And I think the way the ocean sort of changes its character, the way it's read differently by different parts of the book, seems extraordinary. Just to have it be like a refuse an easy read, and to let all of the characters sort of change as they go in that way seems really great to me. I don't know, I'm really excited to sort of dig into all of this. Caroline, I'll get out of the way.
Okay, excellent. I'm super excited to dive into this conversation. And I just want to say real quick, Elizabeth, Matt, I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much, Brooklyn Public Library and Orion Magazine, for creating this space, for having the conversation about the intersection between books and climate, and for having this climate read space. I'm really delighted to be here. So yes, and it's really lovely to hear sort of the different prisms through which we're looking at this work, right, and envisioning this work. And it's true, Matt and Elizabeth, I just started to have a conversation earlier about my story with this book, which is, 5 years long, right? So I first read the book 5 years ago, and full disclosure, I had it as a review copy because I reviewed it for the San Francisco Chronicle. So it was actually before it came out, and I had already read Patricia's first book, her collection of stories, Vida, and had sort of admired her work, and as a fellow Latina writer and as a fellow immigrant writer, had already kind of felt in conversation with her work on various levels, and I wasn't coming at it the way that you each were, which was kind of already with the context and prism of how is this a climate read, right? And just was so captured by the power of the language, the raw honesty and kind of visceral tenderness of the portrayal of Reina, the main character, and the many journeys taken. But I think that I would zero in on one thing that really surprised me most or struck me most about the novel then. And in my revisiting of it in the last week or two, preparing for this panel, it kind of rose up for me again, is the way that this book kind of transcends our human ideas of borders. If we think of Colombia and Cuba at all in this country, we think of them as places that are really far away from the US, including really far away from Miami. And it doesn't occur to us, for example, that, Colombia, Havana, Miami are much closer to each other than, let's say, San Francisco and Chicago, or San Francisco and you over there in Brooklyn, right? And where I am here in Oakland on Ohlone land, because we have a geopolitical conception of land and of physical distance, and a linguistic and cultural conception, right? This is English-speaking area, that's Spanish-speaking area. It's a completely different planet. And a lot of immigrant literature does work with that feeling of, these two cultures are so different. These are such different worlds. It's like being on a different planet. It's like moving through a portal into another reality, being in another country. That can be a very powerful form of narrative. But here in this work, it really does feel like the ocean, this natural component of the world, is a kind of connector that brings together elements of people's personal stories, people's personal realities, that in fact, these places are all connected by the ocean, and that the ocean is almost an entry point into a reality that transcends borders. Meanwhile, the borders in this book are not, romanticized or ignored. They're very real. So it's the checkpoints and the policing and the kind of human systemic social structures that limit people in their ability to move around. But nature is a kind of source of being able to understand yourself as part of something larger, personally, spiritually, also culturally and politically. And I think that is a beginning place also for thinking about climate change. I mean, even rereading this book and thinking about the recent heat wave and how, it was sort of talked about in the media as if Canada and Oregon and Washington were completely separate, but it was one kind of larger regional heat wave experience. And so this idea of transcending our notions of constructed borders is something that will help us in thinking together about how we sort of collectively face the climate crisis.
Carolina, that's so interesting that you say that and you put Cuba, Colombia, Miami in direct conversation, immediate conversation with one another in this book, because I think you're absolutely right in pointing that out. And I should give a sort of another disclaimer, which is my husband is from Colombia and his parents are from Cartagena. And so the Cartagena that I visited in the book, it's sort of like, okay, I know this Cartagena. And I know the Miami. I've spent a lot of time doing sea level rise reporting down there. And you are right in calling out this idea of how separate I hold those places in my mind, but it's also calling up something that my husband always tells me, which is like, no, Cuba and Cartagena, Havana and Cartagena are so deeply entwined with one another in terms of their shared history. And so I love that you're, inviting us to think about how the Caribbean acts as a reminder of that history that these places share and the present they share. And there's something for me that happens in this book that I started to pick up on, that is often when Reina is talking about the ocean or looking at the ocean or diving into the ocean, time slips, right? You suddenly are in her childhood, or you're suddenly back. Carlitos isn't dead. He's still very much living and she's still tending to him. And so there's some part of me that was thinking about the ocean and the Caribbean as connective tissue through sort of different space times, like through different, I think a lot about geologic time and how hard it is for us to think outside of time scales that are immediately recognizable. And so for me, one of the things that was so fascinating was to think about how the ocean acts as a conduit into the past in this book. And it seems like there's so much time travel. It's so richly sort of layered, and there are these echoes and ripples of past events that continually reverberate through the present. For me, that's again coming back to this idea of the ocean as a thing with agency. And that is an example of sort of our borders between the animate and inanimate world blurring, and our borders between past and present blurring. And so I'm curious, you know, Matt, where are you seeing sort of, where do the traditional categories that we place stuff in sort of start to get foggy in this book? And how does that, I guess, as a writer, how do you think of her constructing that blurriness? Like, it's so hard to teach readers to think beyond those standard categories. And Carolina, I would love to hear you weigh in on this as well. You know, how does that get constructed, right? If we're going to like peel back, this is part of what this book is doing, and I'm wondering how it does it, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear what Carolina thinks of this too. But I think a couple of things maybe. I read Carolina's review this morning and was interesting about that same thing about distance. And I was thinking, I'm not as familiar with that part of the world. You know, I grew up in the Midwest and lived in the Southwest, and you know, I've spent very little time in that area. And I was thinking about the ways in the book, once that idea was in my head about these three locations being close together, was they feel very far apart in the first half of the book. When they talk about Cuba, they talk about Colombia, they feel incredibly distant. They don't feel geographically close. And then at the end, the travel is not even really in the book, right? It's just sort of like, they just like portal to these places almost. And like, they're so close that's like, you should come to Havana. It's just like, she's there, you know, it's sort of like the way that collapses. And I think similarly, I have a limited experience with the ocean. Like, the ocean for me is something I've always traveled to. I've never lived on or spent time with, but I grew up at the Great Lakes and a similar sort of large bodies of water that you can't see the other side of, you know. I've lived in the desert, in the Sonoran Desert, for the last 7 years. And one of the things that happened when I moved here was that I had to learn to see the desert, right? Like, you know, it's just sort of a blank at first in a certain way. You don't know the animals, you don't know the plants, you don't know the seasons. And I couldn't really interact with it. And then you start to learn, you kind of unpack. And I think there's something about bodies of water that have a similar thing when you're not familiar with them, right? There's like the sort of flatness of the surface or the waves, but it's hard to see that they're full of life. It's hard to know that. There's a scene where Reina goes diving for the first time, or goes in the boat for the first time, and you can start, and you have Nesto's sort of underwater sort of life that he has, and you see these ways in which, partly because Engel's such a beautiful, detail-oriented sentence writer, that you're being given access to the life of this place, not only the people but the animals and the locale. And I think that way that the book asks me to pay attention and that way is like a way of connecting with this body of water that connects the places and the people as well. And I found that incredibly moving, sort of to be asked to see the ocean better than I'd seen it, and therefore to be asked to see the animals and the people of the ocean better than I'd seen them, seemed really fantastic.
You know, Carolina, were you going to add something? I don't want to.
Yeah, but please riff on that, and then I'll riff. That's great. I love conversations that have within them the riffing. You know,
Yes,
please.
yes.
So I'm just so grateful that you're reminding me of the scene of her on the boat for the first time, and the rich detail that went into this like sort of seemingly like quotidian experience that's also about sort of learning to gain a sense of steadiness in a space that's completely new or shifting for you, and the sense of like sort of being invited to, I go back to this like move beyond your comfort zone into a new a new sort of unknowable, uncomfortable experience. And the idea that you might find something that will save you or that will support you or that will help you survive distress in those moments, to me is something that, again, I guess, you know, I did come to this book with this climate lens, but I kept finding myself thinking like, oh, there are lessons here about how to survive in duress and how those folks who aren't haven't historically been the center of the story actually know a lot more about what's happening and will continue to happen as we sort of push our earth past the groove that it's been in for a while. And so, you know, there are moments here that I think one could in some ways like easily devour as part of the novel and kind of forget about, but now I'm remembering it's like, oh yeah, that scene of her throwing up and throwing up again and again, and then also him saying like, well, what if you come into the ocean? Will that help you sort of lose that sense of sickness or overwhelm, that overwhelming sensation?
I got chills when you said that, right? Like, that's a good scene. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is so interesting. So I'm having a bit of an ideaphoria moment, which is that kind of multiple ideas kind of bursting with all of the thoughtful things being said. But one of the strands I want to kind of pull back out and lift up is what you said, Elizabeth, about the geological sense of time, right? And our kind of chronos sense of time as humans and the way that we live in society. And one of the incredible things about the novel as an art form or as a container for storytelling, in my view, among all the fantastic genres of art that we have, the novel is particularly well suited for sort of collapsing or stretching or opening time. We can have, 5 minutes can be 100 pages, or we can, pass decades in a page or in a sentence, and so it's really well suited for that kind of exploration, which I've just started Matt's magnificent new novel. The language is so beautiful, but I get the sense that there is in your novel, Matt, this kind of opening up of what's possible within geological time, right? I mean, just even from the description, we kind of get that idea. And I think one of the things that says to me is, thinking about climate, the novel is really beautifully positioned as a crucible for exploring, what the climate crisis means and how we actually work together collectively among communities and within communities to address it, but also maybe work together with nature itself, right? I mean, we actually are going to need to collaborate with nature in some ways, technologically, culturally, in terms of political will, in order to get ourselves through this collectively and continue to have a habitable planet, which really is the only planet we have, regardless of what like Bezos might say. So, right? So that's one thought is, and I see that in this book, not necessarily, I mean, yes, it's true, Elizabeth, what you say about sort of time does something different, like time is timeless and she's in her past and everything kind of becomes, it's almost as if time becomes liquid when she's in the ocean, right? And I think that's a really powerful kind of, like formal choices are at their most powerful when form mirrors content, right? As a writer, and I feel that happening. But the other thing I would say about what you were bringing up about animate versus inanimate, and is that boundary between what's animate and inanimate being blurred somehow in this book, is I think one of the things that this book is doing is decentering our sort of accepted mainstream Eurocentric ideas of what is animate and what is inanimate. And I'll just bring up real quick, Louise Erdrich has this incredible essay, Two Languages in the Mind, but One in the Heart, where she talks about learning her native Ojibwe-Moan as an adult and kind of reclaiming it. And one of the things that she says in that story is that it is in Ojibwe, nouns are inflected not by gender the way we have in Spanish, for example, but they're inflected as animate or inanimate. And so the Ojibwe word for stone is animate, it is sentient. So she says, it is impossible for me to hold a stone and think in Ojibwe without recognizing that stone as alive. And I feel that in this book happening, not with the Ojibwe context, but with the Yoruba context, right? With this African rooted spirituality that is very common among Black people and other Latin American people in Cuba and in many parts of Latin America. And with these stories of Yemaya and other Orisha, but these deities that kind of exist within and as forces of nature. And there's these stories that are called pataquias, right? These stories, wisdom stories about the Orisha that are integrated into the book. And she, Reina, has her, without giving too many spoilers, her journey not only with the ocean itself, but with her sense of Yemaya, the goddess of the ocean, and connecting with that. And I think that itself invites us to not only blur the boundary between animate and inanimate, but it sort of invites us into a journey of inside of a consciousness where we have an entirely different understanding, right, of what it is to be a human surrounded by nature.
You know, as I'm thinking about it, the character of Nesto really acts as Reina's guide, right? To start to think and act in this way. Like, one thing that I started to pay attention to, you know, you see Nesto regularly sort of making offerings, bringing, you know, I want to say like floating berries onto the sea, or there's this scene, I think New Year's Eve, where he leaves sort of a set of things along the shoreline for Yemaya to receive. And I was starting to look at the verbs in those sections and realize that, like, it's not that the food disappears, like the tide carries it away, or, you know, I think there was also, how would I put it? Often when we have in sort of Western thought systems, an ocean in a book, it's not a character and it doesn't get verbs of action. And the things that happen sort of seem to happen as if by magic, and then the action moves forward. But in this book, like, the verb choices are really interesting, and I'm sure very thoughtful and specific in terms of saying, you know, here's Nesto sort of introducing this idea and this ritual action, and then the language supports that worldview, which I found so elegant. And you know, it's something that I puzzle about in my mind all the time as a nonfiction writer. Like, how can I use language to imbue animacy in what we have been taught to not see as animate? Because there is a sort of reciprocity between us and these forces that, you know, again, seem beyond our control, but we're in conversation with. I think I want to ask one more question, and then I want to open it up to questions in the chat, which great. I just am checking in with the chat to make sure that I haven't missed any major questions, but I think I'm okay. So all of you at home, please send questions in the chat. We would love to talk about any aspect of this book that's sort of enchanting to you. One of the things that also stands out to me in the veins of the ocean is sort of a fierce sense of responsibility. And I think it's really interesting, towards the end of the novel, Reina talks about sort of she's not sure if she wants to continue the burden of care. And yet we also see that her caring for her brother, Nesto's caring for his family, they're caring for the dolphins, his caring for Yemaya, is actually what knits these characters together. Like, it's actually the thing that makes it possible for them to even inhabit the world alongside one another, that they recognize this shared burden of care that they carry with them. And I'm curious, you know, and I had to laugh. I was at a dinner recently, and an academic said to me, like, oh, it's a big trend in academia to talk about care these days. And I was reading this book and I was like, I mean, like, Also, why
funny.
can't that be a central concern in how
Mhm.
we relate to the world? And
Yeah.
shouldn't our literature reflect the difficulty and also the opportunity that comes with like deep care work? And I think that gets to something you were saying, Carolina, that it's also sort of a novel to teach us about what can be learned sort of through collectivity or to joining with other people to get actions done. What does survival for folks remaining in Cuba look like? What are the networks that keep those lives, afloat? And so I think that's sort of where I want to toss my last question out is, how did you see care manifesting in this work? And what are sort of the lessons about what it can bring towards us? And also, what kinds of distance it might also introduce into our lives?
Matt?
I can take a stab. Yeah. And maybe this is slightly sideways of it, but I think it's in the broad conversation. But I think one of the things I was really struck by in this book is all the things that sort of like rhyme or things that sort of go along, but they're never too one-to-one, or there's always sort of an ambiguous way to read something. And, I think, I was thinking about Reina's guilt toward Carlito, and then also her care for him while he's in prison, and how that it relates to her guilt over and care for the dolphin, that the wild dolphin, especially that when that one's brought in, is sort of so obviously not something that should be in that space. Do those things balance each other, to reflect each other? And it's kind of like yes and no. It's like a little of both, right? The more I sort of read, I thought a lot about how alone Reina is for most of the book. She's bereft of her brother. Her mother kind of leaves, when her brother is away, and she's sort of left. Even Nesto kind of makes it clear that when his children aren't with him, he's not really with her. There's this sort of way that like even the people who are close to her are not with her. Then I was like, is the rhyme and connection more between Carlito and the dolphin as imprisoned people, or is it between Reina and the dolphin, who are both like alone, sort of bereft of their pod or their family, or have to find or make one? The people who care for the dolphin in the part of the book we see are humans, right? They're not other dolphins. She doesn't connect with the other dolphins. There's all the, you were just talking about the offerings to the ocean, which I think is another one of those like care rhymes that's, Nesto's sending stuff to his family in Havana, but he's also like making offerings to the ocean, and there's these two, the offering to the ocean seems like enough. It's all the ocean asks of him, and the offer to his family is like never enough. He can't give them everything they need. There's these sort of mismatches between actions. There's a lot of people trying to care for other people in this book. Even people are like, I don't know, crushingly alone and caring for others. And I feel like that's such an interesting thing. And then the end of the book is full of community. I mean, like the Havana chapters is so full and so lush with people and families that are working in their own way. And it feels so like I desperately needed to be at those families by the end of the book, right? Like, I mean, I was so glad to be in that space and to feel the connection between the cities as the space collapses, as Carolina talked about. I don't know. I think there is like a real movement from aloneness to community via care, if that makes sense. Like that feels like part of the movement of the book in a lot of different threads. I find it just incredibly moving.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it is a thread through the book in different ways. I mean, down to the beginning when she sort of saves that the bird, right? The gull,
yeah.
right? And it's like, and then she can't save that one, but we see kind of in her this instinct. And I think in some ways we were invited to look at the shadow side of care too.
Yeah.
I mean, that people often feel pressured to or chained to something by whether it's by their trauma or a family debt, or often for women or for women of color or for immigrants, people feel, bound to taking care of others at their own expense. Like, where is that line? I do feel like this book grapples with that in complex ways. And then there's so much in it about what do we owe each other, and what is care, in terms of bonds. And I love what you brought up about the family relationships in Cuba and how rich that is in comparison to the deep isolation that Reina at one point has, right? She's totally cut off from her family, and she's just going on her own, and then what she shapes from there. I think thinking of it in the context of climate crisis, also, it really is interesting to think about modes of care within immigrant communities and refugee communities, and among people whether within community or even as strangers. I mean, acts of kindness. What is going to be called on from us You know, as our world gets destabilized by climate change. It was just today there was an article in the Washington Post about wet heat, right?
Mhm.
And how places that have heat and humidity together are on their way to becoming, you know, really dangerous for humans to inhabit. And among the places that that seem to be on that trajectory are Mexico, Central America, India, Pakistan. So if that were to happen in the coming decades and people were to become less able to survive in those places, we're going to have, you know, we still already have refugee movement and refugee crises. We're going to have more of that. How much care are we willing to, you know, provide socially and personally? And I think on page 1 of this book, we see that in this really subtle way that I didn't pick up the first time I read it, but it was really on returning, one of those little sort of like nuggets under the surface, which is in describing, and this isn't too much of a spoiler for people since it's on the first page, but in the description of this devastating thing that happened where Carlito was thrown by his father from the bridge, he was saved by a 60-year-old Marielito, and it just kind of moves on, right? And a reader may or may not know that a Marielito is a refugee from Cuba who came in a wave of people who were really impoverished and under-resourced and really coming from a place of despair. And I want to also acknowledge we're having this conversation in the context of a moment when the Cuban people are currently protesting, and there is and I know Cuban politics is very complex, but there, you know, really there are a lot of people really afraid for their lives right now, or for the lives of their loved ones who've been sort of, you know, arrested. So I just want to acknowledge that we're in a moment right now when, at least, you know, for me, like, Cuba is very much in my heart, and I know in a lot of people's hearts. So in any case, this Marielito is this refugee, and he does this beautiful act where he saves this baby, and then for 10 years he has a what is it? It's like a big fishing hook. His back is like curved like a fishing hook for the rest of his life. And we just get this little detail, and then we move on from him. We never see him again. So I think about that moment and this generous, you know, aging refugee. She doesn't use the word refugee, but under the surface, that's what he is. And this kind of act of kindness that comes from him, and, you know, from someone who is so socially vulnerable, you know, on the very first page. And I think that invites us really to think about care, and then the kind of thing that Reina does herself with the dolphin, and you know, sort of ongoing how that thread continues through, and, you know, really invites us to think, invites me certainly to think.
Can I add one quick thing? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Go for it, Matt.
I would just really quickly, I'll just say, like, I also keep thinking in this conversation about care, about the boy in the trees that's come onto the shore early in the book, and they're not being able to help him. And that just haunts all this other choices to save people or help people, and the way that, like, the person you couldn't help is also sort of a haunting of the book in that way. And sort of,
and it's like there's so much in this book that I expected to come back that also doesn't resurface. I was like, so when's the boy coming back? Right. And he never comes back. And when, you know, you're the Cuban refugee in the beginning comes back briefly, but then he's also gone again. And there's this sense that some fundamental stability that we might expect is just not there. And I think that also gets to this question around, like, how does this book teach us about living in a world as it changes really fundamentally beneath our feet? I think part of what you're pointing out, both of you, is that Engel doesn't allow us to think about care as something without cost. Like, there is a weight to caring, and there's a weight to carrying the care that you have to perform when there isn't a social system to buoy that person in the way that you think that they should be buoyed. I mean, I think that in many ways that's sort of, again, what we're dealing with, this, like, absence of some very foundational principles that, you know, around sort of human rights and what, you know, right moral action towards one another ought to look like. And we kind of live in a little bit of a world that we understand as being sort of fundamentally not having that at its core. I do want to, I think we have a question in the chat here that in some ways gets a new twist on the conversation that we're having about care.
Right.
Melody asks, this may be a hard question. This may be hard to answer, but my question is, I'm an educator and I love to hear what young people have to say about protecting and taking care of nature, our planet, and its people. Sometimes though, it feels like a huge weight we adults have put on young people. As writers who care so much about our planet, how do you feel when you're thinking about young readers? And young students? I think that we all interact with students quite regularly.
I mean, for me, this question cuts close really personally as a mother, right? Because I have two kids and they're 9 and 12. And, you know, my son is an aspiring biologist and he's a young Afro-Latino dude with 2 moms who wants to go into the sciences and be an, you know, ecological biologist in this world that is so rapidly changing. And I watched this incredible heartbreak that he has, you know, in facing the realities of climate change. So it's very, I don't know that this speaks to like how we can, what we can do for young readers. I don't personally write for young readers specifically, although I also think it's pretty rad when teenagers realize that they can read things off of the grown-up shelves, you know? And I mean, I still remember when I was a teenager and I realized, if I go and I take books from the, you know, the adult, but nobody will stop me, you know? And there I was like swimming through like Milan Kundera and things that were entirely inappropriate, but also really interesting and powerful, right? So I pick on him because it was quite inappropriate. But so that is to say, I mean, I think, you know, youth are listening. And you know, they're listening to what we say and what we do and the conversations that we have and also our actions. And I just think, you know, it is devastating. It is devastating to look at the kids right now and see what we are sort of creating for them or haven't been able to stop. But I do think that they will be part of the solution. We just need to keep doing our best until they can get there. I mean, I also feel like I feel so much hope for these rising generations. They don't have the same kind of blinders and illusion and ingrained denial that we older adults do, or older or younger adults, you know, that Gen Xers like me and above seem to sometimes, you know, we grew up into a different world, and they unfortunately don't have that innocence about the climate crisis. But at the same time, their eyes are really open, and that gives me hope.
I love all of that. I think I've been thinking a lot the last couple of years. I turned 40 this last year, and I've been thinking a lot about like still feeling like a very like young person, and that I'm not in charge of things, while being, you know, like a 40-year-old homeowner who's an associate professor at a research one university, right? You know, like I'm not in charge of anything, like, you know. And I think people my age have been like running the world for a while, or large chunks of the world, you know, and that so the world that we have, we've been adults for a long time. Like the world we have is our fall too. And I do feel also what Carolina talks about us like blindered in a way that people aren't now. But you know, I was writing about Ursula Le Guin this week, and there's a part in her essay, Earth to Revision, where she talks about going through the sort of second wave feminist revolution, her work changing. And she says, what was innocence has become ignorance. And like, and once that happens, then you have to act, and you have to change what you think and what you do. And I think maybe that's how we got to show that we've done that. If our innocence has become ignorance, then we have to do better. And maybe that's what we have to show young people that we've learned and that we're willing to do.
Yeah, and I think there's some, you know, like our generation, I think we were raised on sort of this idea that the earth exists in a kind of natural balance. Like there's like the rain cycle, and there's evaporation, and then precipitation, and then, you know, and that kind of goes around and around. And so part of what our generation has had to learn to do is unfamiliarize ourselves with that idea of sort of the earth being in a kind of equilibrium. Like I think that we live in the wake of disasters, and you know, many ecologists will tell you that, you know, if you're looking at a river, you're looking actually at the evidence of like the last most devastating flood, and the river holds the course that that flood sort of bent into it. And I think young people just kind of like know that in a way that, you know, it was painful for us to learn. And in many ways, you know, I think it depends on like what age young you're talking about. But when I think about like my college students, I think I actually have a lot to learn from them around how immediately they point to environmental justice and social justice being connected, how, you know, profoundly awake they are to the idea that sort of vulnerability is not arrived at by chance. It has a history, and we can change that history through, you know, specific political action in the present and moving forward. Like, I think that they, but I also, you know, that's me talking about like my woke brown students. So it's certainly like a certain demographic. And then I think about, you know, my 1-year-old son and how I want to instill in him a sense of wonder, and also in that wonderment, an awareness that like species thrive through interdependency. I want to show him not just the monarch butterfly, but the milkweed that the monarch needs to lay its eggs. Like, I think that part of my responsibility as an educator is showing him the depth to which like no one thing exists alone, and then the interesting collaborations that arrive in the wake of disturbance, the interesting and important and life-saving collaborations that arise out of disaster. I think that to think about how those connections are actually the things that help us move forward and what it means to work in service of them is certainly a way that I try to think about, you know, working as an educator in this space.
Yeah.
I think we have a question, a live question from Carrie. Carrie, what's your question?
Hey guys, I'm one of the members of Writers Rebel NYC. So this question comes from our reading guide that we put out with every book that we do each month. So this one is the last question on the reading guide, and it touches on what we've like these are such grand themes, right? Isolation and care, but this is kind of care's counterpoint, I suppose. And I really appreciated hearing you guys talk so much about care. So this is kind of the opposite, I suppose. But let me read this short conversation between Raina and Nisto. She says, referring to the dolphins, "You don't think they lose their instincts? No animal does. That's why they're called instincts. Everything that is learned can be unlearned, even if they're captives for years and years." And he says, even after generations have passed and their ancestors were the last ones to taste freedom. And the question is, put this conversation within the context of generational trauma. Consider the Seminole that are mentioned in the book and all Indigenous peoples, and consider animals in captivity. And you could also put it in within context of Raina's own family, because there's generational trauma that they talk about very clearly, but there's also generational care, which I started thinking about as throughout your guys' conversation, and how they cared for each other from generation to generation, and then also because there's generational trauma. So I guess that's my response to it. But what do you guys think about that theme within the book?
I have maybe a short, quick thing to say, and then I'll get out of the way about it. I don't know that I can speak from the point of view of Indigenous peoples or animals in captivity. I mean, obviously I know I can't, but I think from like my position, I've thought a lot the last couple of years about the cost of my life on other people and on other beings and other landscapes, and the want to reduce that cost, to do less harm by the way I'm living, to sort of know that some of what makes my life easy or livable is harm exported on other people or other people's bodies. The pandemic made that really obvious. I mean, right, the sort of people who kept your life going so that you could stay home is immense and felt. And I think that's something that I will continue to take forward in these thoughts about the generational cost of the life that I have, which many of the decisions were not ones I made, but I benefited from, and then the decisions I make in my own life that I'm still waking up to and still finding all the time new ones that things I didn't even think about that are a cost someone or somewhere or something is bearing for me. And the less of that I have to put into the world, the better. And sort of trying to be awake to that and to actually change around it where I can is really increasingly sort of important to me.
That's great. Yeah, that's a great passage to pull forward and to think about intergenerational trauma, which I think is very present here. And I think we also very often see explored in immigrant literature, in immigrant writing, in diasporic writing of and about and from diasporas and within communities of color. And that's one of the powerful things I think about reading immigrant literature and literature by writers of color. Not all immigrant literature or literature by writers of color will necessarily inherently be about the climate crisis, but certainly we can't fully have a literature of climate change and our response to it without those voices, where, you know, addressing the intergenerational traumatic effects of white supremacy and xenophobia and patriarchy and other forms of oppression is really key to also addressing the imbalances in nature that are really threatening us today. I mean, you know, Elizabeth started us out by talking about, you know, nature wasn't the menace in the context of this story, even though the ocean is menacing in the sense of sea levels having devastating consequences. The menace is not the ocean itself, right? And the menace really is the systems that are preventing change. You know, the sort of corrupt political systems that are actively preventing the solutions to climate crisis that we do know exist, that experts are talking about, that are possible. But the barriers that are being set up are being thrown up by the same people who are also upholding white supremacy. So we cannot address the climate crisis without dismantling white supremacy and xenophobia and patriarchy. It's simply not possible. I mean, just one example is the way that you know, right-wing politicians in this country, in the United States, have sort of weaponized white supremacy for voter suppression, you know, such that then, you know, they can continue to block implementation of climate solutions. It's very, I mean, that's just one way. And also, of course, that, you know, the communities of color are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate crisis. It's just a couple of examples. But I think when we think about healing from intergenerational trauma, it's something that is very much connected with those themes. And I think that's one thing that is so absolutely wonderful and powerful for all of us, whatever our own backgrounds might be, about reading diasporic books, reading diasporic narratives and immigrant narratives and narratives by and about people of color. They have something for all of us in our collective existence.
I couldn't agree more, Carolina. I think maybe I'm just going to keep the chat open for another second and see if anybody else has other questions that they want to pose before we wrap up our discussion. I think, you know, what we see happening here and thinking about that question around sort of intergenerational trauma, I think part of what the novel does is quietly sort of again and again stage a kind of distrust for certain centralized or centralizing narratives that flatten these diasporic tales into one sort of cohesive narrative arc. Like, I think part of what we've come up again, what I was going to come up against in terms of sort of like rendering a reading of this novel is just how many places it contains thorny contradictions that don't refuse to sort of easily get sorted out. Like, care is both a unifier and a burden. We see these spaces, you know, Miami, Havana, Cartagena, as both sharing in a kind of shared history and yet also like inherently kept apart from one another. And we see characters move beyond those barriers, but we also know they still exist. And so I think there's something about the book that's sort of teaching us a distrust of a centralizing narrative that is really
Mm-hmm.
part of thinking about like intergenerational trauma can also teach a kind of skepticism that I think we also see performed in the book. You see that there's like a short scene where someone is sort of, I think it's at the dolphin aquarium, where someone sort of dismisses what Sonny, this Seminole Native American, was going to say, because, you know, they're like, oh, he doesn't trust the government, so don't listen to his theories. And I think the book is sort of like giving us the opposite of that. Like, there's an inherent sort of dismissal of that narrative, but
That's question number 7 on the reading guide.
That place of skepticism is sort of the position that I think you're partly being invited to occupy. So I think on that note, I will probably wrap up our conversation. It has been a complete honor. It's not every day that I get invited to talk about a fiction book, so that also felt like incredibly exciting and exhilarating for me. And it's been wonderful speaking with you, Matt and Carolina. I hope that we can continue the conversation going moving forward, and I hope everyone gets to delve into this book, because it is absolutely a page turner and has many lessons to teach us about the future that we share.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. They were fantastic. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth, for your incredibly smooth and nuanced and thoughtful and fabulous moderation, and Matt for the conversation.
You
All the
too.
great
Thank
stuff.
you, Caroline.
Here, and thanks also. I mean, that was an amazing conversation, and every month people who come back know that I say that it was my favorite every month, and it keeps being true. They just, you know, they all sit so well together. It was lovely to hear you all think out loud. And thanks to Amy Brady and Orion Magazine. Thanks to Carrie and Elliot and everyone from Writers Rebel New York City. We are going to drop in the chat, if we haven't already, ways to follow all of the organizations that were involved, courtesy of my colleague Will. Thank you, Will. And to the audience, thanks Melody and everyone who asked questions and made comments, Liz and Elliot, and offered quotes. It was, we'll be back next month with Trace, and you can figure out when. I don't think we have a date yet, on Writers Rebel NYC and on BPL Presents, which is there in the chat. Thanks for being with us, and have a great night, everyone.